June 4th, 1913. It's the Epsom Derby in England. It's,
Wow.
one of the most prestigious horse races in the entire world. The king's own horse is running. The stands are just packed with the absolute peak of British high society.
Setting the scene.
Right. And right in the middle of this massive race, a 39-year-old Oxford-educated woman named Emily Wilding Davison, she ducks under the guardrail.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And she steps directly into the path of the king's horse, Anmer, which is thundering down the track at like 30 miles an hour.
Just horrifying.
It really is. She's struck, she's trampled, and she dies from her injuries a few days later. And the detail that always gets me is she had a suffragette flag literally sewn into her coat.
It is a profoundly jarring image, isn't it? I mean, when you study the history of political movements, there is this temptation to view them as a calm, inevitable march toward progress.
Right, like a polite debate.
Exactly. A polite debate where the better argument eventually just wins out in Parliament. But Emily Wilding Davison completely shatters that illusion.
Yeah, she really does.
She reminds us that the history of feminism is not a clean, linear timeline. It is visceral, it is bloody, and, it's born out of just intense, boiling frustration.
Which is the exact landscape we are wading into today. We've got this towering stack of historical texts, political manifestos, and literary theory on the table. It's a comprehensive overview of feminism.
Very heavy stack.
Super heavy. And our goal for this deep dive is to organize this sprawling, messy, centuries-long struggle for you. We really want to trace how the core demands of this movement evolved over time, moving through what historians typically categorize as 4 distinct waves.
Right.
But looking at the sheer violence and radicalism of that 1913 moment with Davison, it seems, completely inadequate to just treat this as a dry chronological timeline.
Oh, it absolutely is inadequate. And before we trace any timeline, we have to establish a foundational ground rule for this entire deep dive.
Okay, lay it on me.
Feminism is not, and has actually never been, a single unified doctrine.
Okay, so no central rule book.
Exactly. There is no central rule book. It is much more accurate to describe it as a family of ideas. It's a constellation of overlapping, sometimes deeply contradictory perspectives.
That makes sense.
Yeah. The only real gravitational force holding this family together is a shared recognition that women are systematically subordinated, and a shared demand that the structure causing that subordination just has to change.
So I picture it less like a textbook timeline and more like a massive multi-generational dinner party.
Oh, I like that.
Right, like a dinner party that has literally been going on for centuries. And at this table, there is this relentless, passionate, sometimes furious argument happening.
Oh, yeah. Voices are definitely being raised at this party.
Totally. The guests are arguing over the most fundamental questions imaginable. Like, what exactly is a woman? What does she deserve?
Yeah.
And what invisible forces are holding her back? And as the decades pass, new guests pull up chairs. They bring entirely different lived experiences to the table. They point out who was, deliberately left off the guest list. They flip plates over, and they completely change the direction of the conversation.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. To trace this history is to trace a massive, evolving argument. But to really understand the volume of the argument, you have to appreciate the profound silence that preceded it.
Right. The historical silence.
Exactly. The word feminism itself didn't even emerge into general use until the late 19th century, borrowed from the French word feminism. But the underlying impulse, that deeply rooted feeling that women were being artificially confined, is ancient.
So let's set that baseline for you. Because if you look at the recorded traditions of virtually every ancient civilization, they are just steeped in patriarchy. They are fundamentally organized around male authority.
Completely.
Take classical Greek philosophy, which is essentially the bedrock of Western intellectual, legal, and political life. It is staggeringly hostile to the concept of women's equality.
Extremely hostile. I mean, you have Aristotle, whose biological and political writings shaped European thought for nearly 2 millennia.
2,000 years of influence.
Yeah. And Aristotle didn't just casually think men were better. He argued it as a scientific certainty. He classified women as literally incomplete men or mutilated males.
Mutilated males. That is so brutal.
It really is. In his view, they were biologically deficient in rational capacity. And because they supposedly lacked this higher rationality, he argued it was an absolute mandate of nature that they be subjected to male authority and confined to the domestic sphere.
Right, so it wasn't just an opinion for him.
No, to him, it was biology dictating destiny.
But even in an intellectual climate that hostile, there are cracks in the foundation, right? It wasn't a total monolith.
No, there were always cracks.
You look at Plato, who was Aristotle's own teacher. In the Republic, Plato sets out to design the perfectly just society. And he actually suggests that if a woman possesses the right natural abilities, she should absolutely be educated and permitted to serve as a guardian of the state right alongside men.
Which is wild for that era.
Right. For ancient Athens, that was a wildly provocative thing to write down.
It was a massive departure from the norm, even if Plato's overall views on gender remained, highly contradictory. And we see these isolated voices popping up across the globe, too.
Oh, like where?
Well, in ancient China, during the Han Dynasty, you have Ban Zhao. She was a brilliant historian and philosopher who wrote extensively advocating for women's education.
Oh, wow.
And in ancient Egypt, the legal structures actually allowed women to own property, initiate divorce, and execute wills rights that Greek and Roman women could barely even fathom.
As we move into the medieval era, that tension really continues, particularly within the church.
Oh, absolutely. The church is a huge part of this.
Right, because on one hand, you have the elevation of the Virgin Mary, this impossible ideal of silent, submissive purity.
The ultimate unattainable standard.
Totally. On the other hand, you have the pervasive narrative of Eve, which was used to associate all women with inherent temptation, weakness, and moral danger.
The virgin-whore dichotomy basically starts right there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But navigating right through that paradox, you find figures like Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century.
She's fascinating.
She was a German abbess, a prolific theologian, a visionary, a composer, a medical writer. She corresponded with popes and emperors, exercising just immense, tangible authority.
You also have Christine de Pizan in early 15th century France. She was actually the first woman in Europe to make a living as a professional writer.
Wait, really? The first one?
Yeah. She wrote a foundational text called The Book of the City of Ladies, and in it, she directly confronts the deeply misogynistic literary tradition of her time.
How does she do that?
She literally constructs an allegorical city populated by noble, accomplished women from history to prove women's moral and intellectual equality. It's brilliant.
That's incredible.
But historically speaking, we cannot call these women feminists in an organized political sense. That label implies a modern political framework that they just didn't have.
Right. They're isolated voices. They are whispering their discontent into the void of history rather than organizing a collective roar. So how do we cross that chasm?
That's the big question.
Yeah. How do we go from a few brilliant women writing treatises in their private studies to a massive organized political movement?
To make that leap, society needed a fundamental rewiring of how it understood human existence. It needed an intellectual earthquake, and that earthquake was the Enlightenment.
The 17th and 18th centuries, the age of reason. This is where the conditions for the first wave of feminism are actually forged.
Yes, exactly.
Because the Enlightenment completely overthrew the old justifications for power. It declared that human beings are defined by their capacity for reason.
Reason becomes the new God.
Right. And if you have reason, you inherently possess natural rights, rights to liberty, property, and self-determination that no king, no church, and no traditional hierarchy can violate without your consent.
Exactly. The Enlightenment demanded that all traditional structures be subjected to rational scrutiny. But this unleashed a massive, glaring paradox that the philosophers of the era really struggled to contain.
What was the paradox?
Well, if reason is the universal inheritance of humanity, and if all rational individuals have natural rights, on what logical grounds are women excluded from the civic institutions governed by reason?
Oh, yeah. That's a huge loophole.
It's a massive contradiction.
And that paradox is the exact moment Mary Wollstonecraft enters the conversation. The year is 1792. The French Revolution has just completely upended the social order next door.
Heads are literally rolling.
Literally. And Wollstonecraft publishes A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. From the sources we're looking at, this is arguably the single most influential feminist text of the 18th century.
Oh, undoubtedly.
She grabs the Enlightenment's promise of universal reason by the collar and basically demands it be applied to women.
She did. And Wollstonecraft's primary target was a concept we might call sentimentalized femininity.
Sentimentalized femininity.
Right. She fiercely critiqued thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Who was supposed to be like the big Enlightenment guy.
Exactly. He was the champion of liberty. But Rousseau had argued that while men should be educated for independence and rational citizenship, women should be educated specifically to be charming, compliant, emotionally expressive, and completely dependent on men.
So Wollstonecraft looked at that and basically said, you are actively creating the inferiority you claim is natural.
Yes.
Her argument is so sharp. She stated that the apparent intellectual shallowness of women wasn't a biological given. It was the direct result of a catastrophic, deficient education system.
A system that starved them.
Right. A system that kept them in a state of perpetual childhood, rewarding them for vanity and emotional manipulation while starving them of intellectual rigor.
Her thesis was the absolute bedrock of early liberal feminism, basically. Yeah. If you give women a proper education, equal in scope and rigor to men, they will prove themselves to be the absolute intellectual equals of men.
So it's an access issue.
Exactly. They will become rational citizens, not just ornamental playthings. Liberal feminism is entirely anchored right here in the belief that women simply need access to the existing structures of education, law, and politics to achieve equality.
But okay, let me challenge Wollstonecraft's framework for a second here.
Go for it.
If her solution is to attack sentimentalized femininity and urge women to embrace reason, isn't there a hidden trap there?
How so?
Well, by accepting the Enlightenment's premise that reason, which is a concept historically defined and structured entirely by men, is the ultimate human virtue, did she inadvertently validate a male standard as the only correct way to exist? Like, is the underlying message here basically, to be respected, women must act more like men?
That is a profound critique. And it is precisely the tension that later feminist theorists would expose.
Really? So they caught on to this too?
Oh, definitely. Wollstonecraft was operating within the only language of power available to her, the language of Enlightenment rationality. But in doing so, she did elevate a traditionally masculine ideal of stoic, detached reason over traditionally feminine attributes like care, emotion, and relationality.
Which sort of devalues women's actual experiences.
Exactly. It highlights the inherent limitation of early liberal feminism. It seeks assimilation into a male-defined system rather than questioning if the values of that system are inherently flawed or incomplete.
That makes total sense. But despite that philosophical trap, her work provided the necessary spark. As we move into the 19th century, we transition from individual literary arguments into collective political action.
The movement starts to find its legs.
The first wave begins to organize. And the watershed moment, at least in the United States, is the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention in New York, which was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott.
Seneca Falls is where the theoretical demands of the Enlightenment crystallize into a concrete political agenda. They produce the Declaration of Sentiments.
Right.
And what is so strategically brilliant about this document is how they weaponize the foundational text of American democracy against itself.
They hacked the mainframe.
They totally did. They deliberately modeled it on the Declaration of Independence, but they altered the preamble to read,
"We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal."
It's the ultimate political hack. You claim to revere these founding ideals. Let's hold up a mirror and see if you actually mean them.
Exactly. Put your money where your mouth is.
The document went on to list the systematic ways women were subjected to civil death, like being unable to own property, keep their own wages, or secure custody of their children in a divorce.
They essentially had no legal existence separate from their husbands. Right. But among all those grievances, they identified one primary, overarching political necessity: suffrage, the right to vote.
The logic was inescapable. In a liberal democracy, the vote is the fundamental mechanism of power.
It's the only lever you can pull.
Precisely. Without the vote, women had no leverage to change the property laws, the divorce laws, or the education systems. Suffrage became the absolute organizing crusade of the first wave. And as you pointed out with Emily Wilding Davison at the beginning, the fight for the franchise was not a polite academic debate.
No, let's look at the actual tactics. Because in the UK, the movement fractured into two distinct camps. You had the suffragists, led by figures like Millicent Fawcett, who firmly believed in the constitutional approach.
The gradualists.
Right. They lobbied, they wrote petitions, they really believed in gradual, peaceful parliamentary persuasion.
And then, deeply frustrated by decades of parliamentary stalling, you have Emmeline Pankhurst founding the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903.
The suffragette.
Yes. These were the suffragettes. Their motto was deeds, not words. They completely abandoned polite persuasion for militant direct action.
We're talking about a campaign of organized civil disobedience.
Right.
They smashed the windows of government buildings. They chained themselves to railings. They set fire to the contents of mailboxes. They organized massive disruptive marches.
They were causing absolute chaos.
Totally. And when they were arrested and thrown into harsh Victorian prisons, they utilized the hunger strike. The British government's response was just
Brutal.
beyond brutal. They subjected these women to forced feeding. It was a horrific, violent procedure involving tubes shoved down their throats or noses, often causing severe internal injuries. Educated, middle-class women were putting their bodies on the line in a way that completely shocked the conscience of the public.
It was a spectacle of suffering that laid bare the hypocrisy of the state.
Oh, how so?
Think about it. The government claimed women were too delicate for the harsh realities of politics, yet the state was willing to violently torture those same women to maintain its monopoly on power.
Wow, that's a glaring double standard.
The militancy forced the issue into the center of public consciousness, and eventually, the dam broke. The timeline of national voting rights slowly unrolled. You have New Zealand in 1893, Australia in 1902, Finland in 1906.
The UK granted partial suffrage in 1918 and equal suffrage in 1928, right?
Yes. And in the United States, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920.
But right here, we really have to pause and look at the massive, glaring limitation of this first-wave victory. Because while the 19th Amendment was transformative, it was fundamentally incomplete.
It's a very flawed victory.
Extremely. The first wave, both in its leadership and its political imagination, operated almost entirely within a framework that centered the experiences of white, middle-class women.
This is a vital historical corrective. The 1920 Amendment in the U.S. prohibited states from denying the right to vote on the basis of sex. So it granted a formal legal right.
Right, on paper.
Exactly, on paper. But for Black women, particularly in the American South, that right existed only on paper. The reality was a brutal system of Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, impossible literacy tests, and the constant threat of violent intimidation.
A white suffragist in New York could cast a ballot in 1920, but a Black woman in Alabama who attempted to register risked her livelihood and her life.
Absolutely.
Black women effectively did not secure the right to vote until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The mainstream first-wave movement frequently compromised with, or actively capitulated to, white supremacy to achieve its narrow goals.
They threw Black women under the bus to get the amendment passed.
They really did. That exclusion, the failure to recognize that woman is not a universal experience, is a massive structural flaw that the later waves of feminism will have to violently confront.
Precisely. But if we look at the timeline from the perspective of the mainstream movement, the vote was won. And there was a palpable sense of exhaustion. The intense, organized energy of the first wave dissipated, and a very dangerous assumption took hold.
What assumption?
The belief that once formal legal equality is achieved, the struggle is over.
Which sets us up for a massive wake-up call. Because the decades following the victory of suffrage, moving through the interwar period, and particularly after World War II, proved that having a legal right to vote does absolutely nothing to dismantle the deeply ingrained social programming in your head or the cultural expectations of society.
Right. During World War II, out of sheer economic necessity, women were heavily recruited into industrial jobs. They built ships, they built planes, they kept the war machine running.
Rosie Riveter.
Exactly. But the moment the war ended and the men returned, there was an intense, coordinated ideological campaign to push women out of the workforce and back into the domestic sphere. The 1950s became an era of aggressive redomestication.
It was everywhere. The cultural messaging was inescapable. Magazine articles, television shows, advertising, even developmental psychology was explicitly telling women, your highest calling, your natural biological destiny, is to be a cheerful suburban housewife.
Find fulfillment in modern appliances.
Yeah. Bake the perfect casserole and raise well-adjusted children. That is the ceiling of your existence.
But beneath the veneer of that manicured suburban consensus, the tectonic plates of feminist thought were shifting. Because in 1949, a French philosopher named Simone de Beauvoir published a massive 2-volume book called The Second Sex.
And this book is huge.
It landed like an intellectual atomic bomb. De Beauvoir was deeply embedded in the existentialist movement alongside Jean-Paul Sartre. And she applied the rigorous framework of existential philosophy to the specific condition of women.
She drops this one sentence that is probably the most famous formulation in all of feminist theory. She writes, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman."
Yes.
Let's completely unpack this for you. Imagine I am encountering existentialism for the very first time. What does it mean to become a woman if you aren't born one?
To understand this, we need a really brief primer on existentialism. The core tenet of existentialism is that existence precedes essence, meaning humans are not born with a predetermined nature, purpose, or fixed essence. You exist first as a free consciousness, and you define who you are through your actions and choices. De Beauvoir took this framework and applied it to gender.
Okay, well, following.
She argued that the biological facts of female anatomy, like menstruation or pregnancy, are merely physical realities. They do not dictate a woman's psychological essence, her capabilities, or her social role.
So the idea that women are naturally passive, naturally submissive, naturally emotional, naturally nurturing, she is saying none of that is actually written into the biology.
Exactly. Those traits are not a biological given, they are an ideological imposition. Society takes the biological female and relentlessly conditions her from the moment she is handed a pink blanket in the hospital to adopt a specific, constructed identity.
It trains her.
Society trains her to become a woman. And de Beauvoir used a crucial Hegelian concept to explain how this works, the dynamic of the subject and the other.
How does that dynamic function?
Throughout history, de Beauvoir observed, man has established himself as the subject. He is the default human, the actor, the transcendent consciousness defining the world.
Like the protagonist.
Right. Woman, consequently, is defined exclusively in relation to man. She is the other. She is the object, the immanence, the negative space. She is everything man is not. Man is strong, woman is weak. Man is rational, woman is emotional. A woman is taught to view herself not as a primary actor in her own life, but as a being existing for the gaze and the utility of men.
I always think of de Beauvoir's insight like the premise of the movie The Matrix.
Oh, I love this analogy.
Right, because up until 1949, it was as if women were walking around inside the Matrix, completely convinced that the rules governing their lives, like how softly they spoke, how they deferred to their husbands, their supposedly innate desire to just clean a house, were immutable laws of nature, like gravity. And the second sex is the red pill. It's the moment women are told, look at the code. None of this is nature. You have been systematically programmed by a patriarchal society to play a subordinate role, and you have mistaken your programming for your biology.
That is a phenomenal analogy. De Beauvoir exposed the artificiality of the code. She provided an incredibly sophisticated theoretical framework. But abstract philosophy alone doesn't start a revolution.
You need boots on the ground.
Exactly. Theory needs fuel to ignite into a mass political movement. And the fuel for the second wave of feminism was provided by the agonizing lived reality of the very women we were just discussing, the women trapped in the post-war suburban dream.
Which brings us crashing into the 1960s and the explosion of the second wave. We are transitioning out of the first wave's liberal demand for basic civic inclusion and moving into radical frameworks where the concept of politics is entirely redefined.
The 60s were wild.
The 60s provided the perfect powder keg for this. You have the civil rights movement, which provided a masterclass in mass mobilization, civil disobedience, and exposed how systemic inequality operates beneath the veneer of the law.
Right.
You have the New Left and the anti-war movement vigorously critiquing American imperialism and capitalism. Though, ironically, the women in those movements found that their male comrades were often profoundly sexist.
Oh, heavily sexist. Relegating women to making coffee and typing up manifestos while the men gave all the fiery speeches.
Exactly. And technologically, you have the introduction of the oral contraceptive pill in 1960.
We cannot overstate how monumental this was. For the first time in human history, women had relatively cheap, reliable, and entirely independent control over their own reproductive capacity.
It's a game changer.
It changed everything. They could decouple sexuality from procreation, and they could plan their educational and professional lives without the constant looming disruption of unplanned pregnancy. You had more women attending universities than ever before, earning degrees, and then hitting an impenetrable wall of cultural dismissiveness and structural discrimination.
Right. And into the very center of this powder keg walks an American writer named Betty Friedan. In 1963, she publishes The Feminine Mystique. And she manages to put a name to the exact psychological suffocation de Beauvoir had theorized. She called it the problem that has no name.
Frieden's methodology was brilliant in its simplicity. She conducted extensive interviews with her former Smith College classmates, mostly middle-class, educated, white suburban housewives.
The demographic living the dream.
The exact demographic. These women had achieved the absolute pinnacle of the American dream as it was sold to them. They had the modern house, the provider husband, the healthy children. But instead of fulfillment, they were plagued by a pervasive, agonizing sense of emptiness. They were constantly asking themselves, is this all? Is this the entirety of my existence?
And before Frieden, if a woman went to a psychiatrist and said, I have everything I'm supposed to want, but I am deeply depressed, the psychiatric establishment, which was, heavily influenced by Freudian ideas, would tell her, the problem is you.
You're broken.
Yeah. You're failing to adjust to your natural feminine role. You need more therapy, or perhaps a tranquilizer, to help you accept your domestic destiny. Frieden flipped the script. She said, the problem is not your brain. The problem is the world. The role you are being forced to play is inherently soul-crushing.
The feminine mystique sold millions of copies because it functioned as a mass revelation. Countless women read it and realized their private, isolating distress was actually a shared structural condition.
That's a huge psychological relief.
It was. Frieden went on to co-found the National Organization for Women, NNOW, in 1966. Her initial goals were largely liberal. She wanted to enforce anti-discrimination laws, secure equal pay, and break down the barriers preventing women from entering the professional workforce.
But the second wave refused to stop at liberal reform. This is where the crucial evolutionary leap happens. The movement spawns a radical wing that looks at Betty Frieden's agenda and says, getting a job as a bank manager is not enough. The entire social fabric is diseased.
They wanted to go deeper.
And the mechanism they used to arrive at this conclusion was the consciousness-raising group.
Yes. The consciousness-raising group is the defining methodology of the second wave. Women, often in small, informal groups, meeting in living rooms, would simply sit in a circle and share their deeply personal experiences. They talked about their marriages, their sex lives, their frustrations with housework, their experiences of harassment on the street.
Let's play this out to show how it worked. A woman might say, I am so angry that my husband refuses to do the dishes or change a diaper after I've also been working all day. Historically, society told her that was a private marital dispute, a personal misfortune.
Sort it out with your husband.
Right. But when she says it in the group, the woman next to her says, my husband does the exact same thing. And the next woman says, mine too. In fact, he gets angry if I even ask. Suddenly, the realization hits. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't just a collection of bad husbands.
Precisely. The realization is that the microscopic details of domestic life are actually the enforcement mechanisms of a macroscopic power structure. This is the origin of the defining slogan of the second wave, which was articulated by Carol Hanisch. The personal is political.
The personal is political. That completely redefines what we consider a political issue, doesn't it?
It shatters the traditional boundary between the public and the private. Before this, politics was what happened in Congress and the military and the economy. What happened in the kitchen or the bedroom was private. The second wave argued that the division of household labor, the control over family finances, the expectation of sexual availability, and the silent suffering of domestic violence, these are not private issues. They are deeply political. They are the sites where patriarchy maintains its power.
So the theoretical frameworks get incredibly radical. You have Kate Millett publishing Sexual Politics in 1970, arguing that patriarchy isn't just a lingering cultural attitude. It is a pervasive, systemic political institution that touches every aspect of human interaction.
It's everywhere.
And then you have thinkers like Shulamit Firestone. In The Dialectic of Sex, she draws heavily on the structural analysis of Karl Marx, but she points to biology.
Oh, this one is wild.
She argues that the root cause of women's oppression isn't just culture or capitalism. It is the biological reality of reproduction itself. She provocatively suggested that to truly liberate women, we would need to radically restructure the nuclear family and eventually use cybernetics and artificial reproduction to free women from the physical burden of pregnancy entirely.
Firestone represents the absolute edge of radical feminist theory. But the broader radical ethos, the belief that the root systems of society had to be dismantled, led to incredibly tangible, transformative, real-world outcomes. This era completely reframed how society understands violence against women.
They took issues that were shrouded in shame and dragged them into the light. The second wave established the first rape crisis centers and the first battered women's shelters.
And fundamentally, they shifted the narrative around sexual violence. Historically, rape was often viewed through the lens of uncontrollable male sexual desire, or as a property crime against a woman's father or husband.
Like damaging someone's goods.
Exactly. Radical feminists insisted and forced the legal system to eventually recognize that sexual violence is not fundamentally about sex. It is a crime of power, control, and domination. It is a tool used to keep women in a state of fear and subordination. They also fought the major reproductive battles, culminating in the 1973 Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision, which established a constitutional right to abortion in the U.S., arguing that compulsory motherhood is a form of state violence.
So just to clarify this monumental shift from the first wave to the second wave for you. If the first wave was essentially women standing outside the halls of power, knocking on the door, asking for a seat at the table so they could participate in the existing liberal democratic system.
Right.
Was the radical second wave basically saying, actually, we got inside, we looked at the table, and we realized the table itself is corrupt. It is built out of our exploitation, the rules of the game are rigged, and we don't want a seat at it. We want to chop the table up for firewood and build something entirely new.
That is an incredibly astute summary. Liberal feminism seeks equality within the existing system. Radical feminism asserts that the existing system is inherently structurally patriarchal, and therefore, true liberation requires dismantling the system entirely.
Which perfectly sets up the next major conflict erupting at our multi-generational dinner party.
Someone just threw a glass.
Totally. Because while liberal feminists are fighting for legal equality in the workplace and radical feminists are exposing the cultural institution of patriarchy, another group of guests is looking critically at the economy. Let's dig into the economic reality check and compare socialist and Marxist feminist critiques with a traditional liberal rights framework.
This is a vital divergence in feminist thought. As we've seen, the liberal framework essentially diagnoses women's oppression as a problem of exclusion. Discriminatory laws and sexist attitudes keep women out of the public sphere. The solution is straightforward. Change the laws, change men's minds, ensure equal opportunity in education and employment, and the problem is solved.
Right. Let me lean in. Let me become the CEO. Pay me the same as the male CEO, and we have achieved equality.
But socialist and Marxist feminists look at that and say, you are completely misdiagnosing the engine of the oppression. They argue that women's subordination is not just a cultural hangover from ancient times. It is a necessary, inextricably linked requirement of the capitalist mode of production. Capitalism literally cannot function without the subjugation of women.
Explain the mechanics of that. How exactly does capitalism require sexism?
It all revolves around a concept called social reproduction, specifically unpaid domestic labor. Classical Marxist theory focused on the industrial worker in the factory. The worker produces a commodity, the capitalist sells it for a profit, and the worker is exploited.
Right, classic Marx.
But Marxist feminists asked a devastatingly simple question. Who produces the worker?
The unpaid wife at home.
Every single day, that factory worker needs to be fed. His clothes need to be washed. His physical and emotional exhaustion needs to be managed so he can return to the factory the next day. Furthermore, the capitalist class needs a constant supply of new workers, which means children must be birthed, raised, socialized, and educated. All of this immense, exhausting, life-sustaining work, cooking, cleaning, caregiving, is performed overwhelmingly by women in the private sphere of the home. And under capitalism, it is entirely uncompensated. It is invisible on the economic balance sheet.
Enter Sylvia Federici in her monumental 1998 book, Caliban and the Witch.
Yeah.
This book absolutely blew my mind. She goes way back to the transition from feudalism to capitalism in early modern Europe.
It's a fascinating historical dive.
And she argues that this transition was not some natural, peaceful evolution of trade. It required an incredibly violent restructuring of society, specifically a violent assault on women's bodies and autonomy.
Federici's historical analysis is staggering. She examines what Marx called primitive accumulation, the violent process by which the capitalist class enclosed communal lands and forced peasants into wage labor. But Federici adds the missing gender dimension.
What's the gender dimension?
Under feudalism, while women were certainly subordinated, the household was a site of communal production. Women's work, Farming, weaving, brewing was recognized as essential economic activity. But as capitalism developed, it required a massive compliant workforce. It needed to turn the home from a center of production into a center of reproduction.
She basically argues that capitalism systematically reduced women to the status of unwaged domestic servants and baby-producing machines, and she points to the European witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries not as a superstitious hysteria, but as a calculated campaign of state terror.
Exactly. It wasn't about magic.
No. The witch hunts were used to destroy the social power of women, particularly older women, healers, and midwives who controlled reproductive knowledge. It was a violent enclosure of women's bodies to ensure they served the demographic and labor needs of the emerging capitalist state.
Exactly. The invisibility of domestic labor today isn't a mistake, it's a structural design. By confining women to the private sphere and naturalizing care work as an act of love rather than an act of labor, the capitalist system effectively shifts the immense cost of reproducing the workforce entirely off corporate balance sheets and onto the shoulders of women.
That is such a scam.
If corporations had to pay a fair market wage for all the cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing required to sustain their employees, the entire profit mechanism of capitalism would collapse overnight.
That is an incredibly powerful critique. But even the socialist feminist framework had a major blind spot. It heavily assumed a standardized experience of the working-class family. And this is where Angela Davis enters the conversation with her landmark 1981 book, Women, Race, and Class.
A huge, huge text.
She utilizes socialist and Marxist analysis, but she forces it to confront the horrific, specific history of race and slavery in America.
Davis's work is indispensable because it shatters the universalized assumptions of both liberal and white socialist feminism. The standard white feminist grievance, articulated by Betty Friedan, was that women were forcibly confined to the home and denied the right to participate in the public labor market. The demand was the right to work. Davis points out that for Black women, that narrative is entirely alien.
Right, because due to the brutal institution of chattel slavery, Black women were never granted the luxury of being fragile, protected domestic housewives.
Precisely. Under slavery, Black women were brutally exploited as heavy agricultural laborers right alongside Black men, while simultaneously being subjected to horrific sexual violence and the systemic destruction of their family units. The patriarchal ideology of sentimental femininity was completely denied to them.
It just didn't apply.
And even after emancipation, systemic racism and the deliberate impoverishment of Black men meant that Black women were forced into the wage labor market in massive numbers, often performing the grueling low-paid domestic labor in the homes of affluent white families.
So let me use Davis's historical reality to challenge the modern liberal feminist framework. Does the lean-in corporate feminist model fail entirely if it doesn't account for who is doing the unpaid labor?
I think you know the answer to that.
Think about it. If a white upper-middle-class woman finally breaks the glass ceiling and becomes a CEO, but she only manages to balance her 80-hour work week by hiring an underpaid woman of color to raise her children and scrub her toilets, has feminism actually achieved anything structural? Hasn't the system simply shifted the burden of exploitation from the white woman to the woman of color, leaving the oppressive structure of capitalism completely intact?
That is the devastating, inescapable critique that socialist and intersectional feminists level at liberal feminism. If your definition of liberation is simply achieving parity with men within a predatory capitalist hierarchy, you are not dismantling oppression. You are merely democratizing the right to be an oppressor.
Right. You just want to steer the Titanic.
You are just fighting for a better position on the sinking ship rather than questioning why the ship is designed to drown people in the lower decks.
So we have feminists systematically proving that the legal system is rigged, the cultural institution of marriage is rigged, and the global capitalist economy is rigged. But then feminist scholars look at the bookshelf, they look at the university syllabi, and they realize that the cultural systems, specifically the literature we revere and the language we use to tell stories, are rigged too.
Time to burn the syllabus.
Which brings us to the emergence of feminist literary theory and the critique of patriarchal canons.
This represents a massive shift of feminist energy into the academy during the late 60s and 70s. And the foundational premise of feminist literary theory is that literature is not an innocent, neutral, purely aesthetic realm.
It's not just art for art's sake.
A novel is not just a pretty story. Literature is one of the primary cultural sites where patriarchal ideology is produced, circulated, and most dangerously, made to look entirely natural and inevitable.
We mentioned Kate Millett's sexual politics earlier in the context of radical feminism, but it's also a foundational text of literary theory. Millett did something revolutionary. She performed close, critical readings of deeply revered canonical male authors, writers like D.H. Lawrence, Henry Miller, and Norman Mailer. These men were celebrated by the literary establishment as brilliant, transgressive geniuses.
But Millett demonstrated with surgical precision how their literary representations of women and male sexuality were essentially exercises in dominance and hostility. She showed how their novels celebrated a predatory, aggressive male sexuality that actively degraded women. The literary establishment had praised these works as profound explorations of the human condition. But Millett pointed out that human in these texts exclusively meant male, and women were merely props, victims, or obstacles in the male hero's journey.
This realization created an absolute crisis for women scholars. If the great books of Western civilization are actively telling women they are inferior, women realized they couldn't just keep reading male authors. They needed to excavate the literary history of women. They needed to find the writers who had been marginalized, ignored, or condescended to by male critics.
This archival impulse leads to one of the most famous works of feminist literary criticism. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar's 1979 study, The Mad Woman in the Attic. They examined 19th century women writers writing in English, the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen, Emily Dickinson, and they diagnosed a profound shared psychological condition among these authors, which they called the anxiety of authorship.
Let's contextualize that anxiety for you.
Yeah.
Imagine being a woman in the 19th century who wants to write a novel. The entire culture explicitly dictates that the act of literary creation, the active, forceful shaping of language and ideas, is an inherently masculine prerogative.
Men create, women consume.
Exactly. The pen is metaphorically coded as a male instrument.
Yeah.
For a woman to presume to write, to step out of her silent domestic role and demand a public voice, was viewed as unnatural, almost a monstrous transgression against her gender.
Women writers were caught in an impossible bind. If they wrote passively and sweetly, they were dismissed as trivial. If they wrote forcefully, they were condemned as unnatural. Gilbert and Gubar argued that to cope with this anxiety, these women developed complex literary strategies. They couldn't always express their rebellion openly, so they encoded it within their texts.
And the title of the book, The Mad Woman in the Attic, refers to the perfect, most famous example of this encoding. The character of Bertha Rochester in Charlotte Bronte's novel, Jane Eyre. For those who haven't read it, Jane Eyre is a governess who falls in love with her employer, Mr. Rochester.
A classic Gothic romance setup.
Right. But Rochester is hiding a dark secret. He has a first wife, Bertha, a Creole woman from the Caribbean whom he has declared insane and literally keeps locked in the attic of his mansion. Bertha is described as animalistic, violent, and utterly mad.
Traditional critics viewed Bertha simply as a Gothic plot device, an obstacle to Jane's romantic happiness. But Gilbert and Gubar radically reinterpreted her. They argued that Bertha is not just a monster, she is Jane's dark psychological double.
Wait, how is she her double?
Well, Jane, as a proper Victorian woman, is required to suppress her rage, her sexual desire, and her profound frustration at her subordinate status. Bertha, locked in the attic, physically acts out the explosive rage and rebellion that Jane is forced to swallow. When Bertha sets the house on fire, she is executing the rebellious desires that Jane harbors but cannot socially enact.
It's an incredible framework. It completely changes how you read 19th century literature. It proved that women writers were subversively grappling with their oppression right under the noses of male critics. From this foundation, theorist Elaine Showalter developed a crucial concept called gynocriticism.
Before gynocriticism, feminist literary theory was primarily focused on exposing the misogyny in male-authored texts. Showalter argued that this was necessary but ultimately limiting because it still kept men at the center of the inquiry.
It's still all about the guys.
Exactly. Gynocriticism demanded a shift in focus. It was the study of women as writers, focusing on the history, styles, themes, and structures of literature written by women. Showalter argued there is a distinct, recognizable female literary tradition with its own lineage and strategies for surviving patriarchy, and it deserves to be studied on its own terms, not just in reaction to men.
While the British and American theorists were doing this vital historical and thematic recovery, across the Channel, the French feminist theorists were taking things to a completely different, highly abstract level. I'm talking about thinkers like Helene Cixous, Luce Irigaray, and Julia Kristeva. And they are integrating heavily with two notoriously complex academic fields, psychoanalysis and post-structuralism.
This is where the theory becomes deeply philosophical. Let's unpack the tools they were using. When we say psychoanalysis, we are primarily referring to the theories of Sigmund Freud, and particularly the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. In the Lacanian framework, a child enters into society, which he calls the symbolic order, by acquiring language. But Lacan argued that language itself is structured around a fundamental lack, and that the ultimate symbol of power and authority in language is the phallus.
Wait, I need to pause here. A listener hearing this might think, are they seriously arguing that grammar is inherently male? How do we explain post-structuralism and this critique of language in a way that doesn't just sound like academic word salad?
Fair question. Let's simplify post-structuralism. Traditional structuralism believed that language is a stable system of signs that accurately point to reality. Post-structuralism, developed by thinkers like Jacques Derrida, argued that language is actually highly unstable, built entirely on binary oppositions.
Like what?
Like light-dark, culture-nature, reason-emotion. And critically, these binaries are never equal. One side is always privileged and the other is devalued.
And the French feminists apply this directly to gender, male-female. The male is always aligned with the privileged side of the binary, reason, culture, light, logic. The female is aligned with emotion, nature, darkness, chaos.
Exactly. They argue that Western language and philosophy is philogocentric, a massive term, meaning it is centered entirely on the masculine, the linear, the logical, the singular authoritative voice. Therefore, a woman cannot truly express her unique lived experience, her bodily reality, or her specific desires using the master's language, because that language was structurally designed to exclude and objectify her.
This leads to Helene Cixous's famous 1975 essay, The Laugh of the Medusa. She calls on women to actively disrupt this rigid, linear male language. She tells women to write the body. She calls it écriture féminine, a distinctively feminine writing. She argued it should be fluid, chaotic, multiple, and overflowing, shattering the rigid syntax of patriarchal logic.
It's a call for a radical aesthetic rebellion.
I always try to visualize this with a musical analogy. Imagine a phenomenally talented female musician. She has spent her entire life composing and playing classical music. But one day she has a profound revelation. She realizes that the standard 12-note scale, the specific instruments of the orchestra, the very rules of harmony and counterpoint, they were all invented centuries ago by men, designed to perfectly express male emotional frequencies.
Right.
She realizes, I physically cannot express what it actually feels like to live in my body, to experience my specific pain or joy using these tools. The tools themselves force me to sound like a man. So what does she do? She decides to invent entirely new instruments, frequencies that shatter glass, a totally new, fluid, chaotic style of music to finally capture her reality. That is what écriture féminine is attempting to do with the language itself.
That analogy perfectly captures the radical ambition of French feminist theory. They wanted to invent an entirely new symbolic order. But just as feminist literary critics in the West were dismantling the male canon and trying to invent new languages, they were about to be hit with a massive, devastating internal critique of their own.
Oh, here comes the reckoning.
Yes, because scholars from outside the white, Western, middle-class framework began asking very uncomfortable questions about who exactly the feminist heroine really was.
This is a crucial pivot. Enter Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak, a foundational figure in post-colonial theory. She writes a famously complex essay titled, Can the Subaltern Speak? The subaltern refers to the populations that are socially, politically, and geographically outside the dominant power structure, specifically colonized peoples. And Spivak looks at Jane Eyre, too.
She reads the same book.
Right. But where the white feminist critics Gilbert and Gubar saw Jane as a triumphant heroine of feminist rebellion, Spivak points out a horrific underlying reality.
Spivak shifts the focus entirely to Bertha Rochester. Remember, Bertha is a Creole woman from the British colony of Jamaica. She represents the colonized subject. Spivak points out that Jane's entire trajectory toward individuality, her economic independence, and her eventual happy marriage to Rochester is literally built on the subjugation, the imprisonment, and ultimately the fiery death of Bertha.
Spivak forces the Western feminist reader to confront a terrifying question. Is the liberation of the white, Western middle-class woman inherently dependent on the silence, the exploitation, and the erasure of colonized women in the global South? Did Jane Eyre just step on Bertha Rochester's neck to climb out of the patriarchy?
It is a devastating critique, and it transitions us directly into the massive reckoning of the late 20th century, intersectionality and the end of the universal woman. Because this was the moment when mainstream feminism's historical tendency to speak confidently on behalf of all women as a single unified group was permanently shattered.
It had to be shattered, because claiming a universal experience of womanhood was inherently exclusionary. It meant defining woman by the experiences of the most privileged women, those who were white, heterosexual, middle class, and Western.
Yes, so many.
This deeply alienated black women, working class women, lesbians, and post-colonial women who looked at the mainstream feminist agenda and said, this does not reflect my reality and it does not address my oppressors.
The pushback was articulate, forceful, and deeply necessary. In 1974, a group of black feminists in Boston formed the Combahee River Collective. In 1977, they released a statement that remains one of the most foundational documents in modern political theory. They explicitly articulated that we cannot view different systems of oppression, racism, sexism, class exploitation, homophobia as separate, isolated silos. They're deeply, inextricably intertwined.
You cannot understand a black woman's experience of sexism without understanding how it is shaped by anti-black racism. You cannot untangle a working-class woman's economic exploitation from her gender. They co-create each other. And this intellectual framework reaches its definitive legal and theoretical naming in 1989, when legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw officially coins the term intersectionality.
It is so important to explain exactly how Crenshaw arrived at this term because it is frequently misused in popular culture today.
Yeah, please unpack this.
Crenshaw was analyzing anti-discrimination law in the United States, specifically a 1976 case called DeGraff and Reed v. General Motors. General Motors had a seniority-based layoff system. The company had not hired black women prior to 1964. So when a recession hit in the 1970s and they laid people off based on seniority, virtually all the black women were fired.
And black women sued, arguing they were being discriminated against as black women. But the court threw the case out.
Exactly. The court's logic was baffling but structurally revealing. The judge said, General Motors still employs women, they were white women, working as secretaries, so it isn't sex discrimination. And General Motors still employs black people, they were black men, working on the factory floor, so it isn't race discrimination.
That is insane logic.
The court refused to recognize black women as a distinct protected legal class. They demanded that the plaintiffs choose whether they were discriminated against as women or are as black people.
Crenshaw looked at this absurdity and coined intersectionality to describe the reality of their lives. The core argument is that oppression is not simple addition. It is not a math equation where racism plus sexism equals double oppression.
Correct. Intersectionality means that when multiple systems of power intersect, they fuse together to create a distinct, qualitatively different, entirely new form of oppression. The discrimination a black woman faces is not merely the sexism a white woman experiences, plus the racism a black man experiences. It is a unique, specific prejudice, misogynoir, targeted exclusively at the intersection of her race and gender.
I always explain it using baking.
Oh, baking. How so?
Well, if you have flour, eggs, sugar, and butter sitting separately on a counter, they are distinct ingredients. But when you mix them together in a bowl and apply the intense heat of an oven, you don't just have hot flour eggs. A chemical reaction occurs. They fuse into a cake. It is a completely new substance. You can't unbake the cake to separate the racism from the sexism. The systems of power fuse together in the lived reality of the individual.
That is a highly effective way to visualize the compounding nature of systemic power. And this necessary dismantling of the universal woman also came fiercely from post-colonial feminist scholars. We mentioned Spivak, but Shonda Tolpade-Mohanty is equally vital here. She wrote an incredibly influential essay titled Under Western Eyes. In it, she argued that Western feminist academics had a terrible, persistent habit of constructing a monolithic idea of the third world woman.
Right. Western texts constantly portrayed women in the global South as this homogeneous, undifferentiated mass of passive victims. Victims of extreme poverty, victims of religious fundamentalism, victims of backward traditions, stripped entirely of their specific historical contexts, their political agency, and their active resistance.
Mohanty pointed out that this wasn't just lazy scholarship. It is a manifestation of what she called epistemic imperialism.
Let's break that jargon down.
Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Imperialism is the policy of extending power through colonization. Epistemic imperialism means using the production of academic knowledge as a weapon of dominance. By defining the third world woman as a helpless victim, the Western feminist positions herself as the enlightened modern savior. It reproduces the exact same arrogant paternalistic power dynamics of historical colonialism, just dressed up in the progressive language of academic feminism.
So, looking at the cumulative weight of all these critiques, Crenshaw, the Combahee Collective, Spivak, Mohanty, I have to pose a strategic question. Did the realization of intersectionality fracture the political power of the feminist movement? Did breaking apart the unified idea of global sisterhood fatally weaken their ability to organize, or did it finally force the movement to be honest about the actual complex reality of women's lives?
It undeniably fractured the simplistic, unified political coalition that characterized parts of the second wave. When you admit that a white, middle-class woman's liberation might actively rely on the exploitation of a working-class woman of color, organizing a unified march becomes incredibly difficult.
It gets messy.
But most contemporary theorists and activists would argue it was a necessary, vital, and ethically mandatory fracturing. You cannot build a durable movement for liberation on a foundation of exclusion, false universalism, and internal exploitation. Intersectionality made the movement radically honest. It made political organizing infinitely more complex, but it made the structural analysis far more accurate to the real world.
And that fracturing, that blowing up of rigid categories and orthodoxies, paves the absolute perfect runway for our arrival in the 1990s. We are entering the third wave, the era of multiplicity, contradiction, sexuality, and performance.
The third wave coalesced in the early to mid-1990s, and it is best understood as a direct, highly conscious, and often rebellious response to the perceived rigidities of the second wave. The daughters of the second wave grew up, looked at their mother's feminism, and decided it was too puritanical, too white, and too focused on a narrative of victimization.
You see this explosive cultural shift. You have the riot girl movement erupting out of the Pacific Northwest, punk scene bands like Bikini Kill, screaming feminist lyrics over distorted guitars, producing raw, photocopied zines, creating a fierce, unapologetic subculture.
Real punk energy.
Totally. You have writers like Rebecca Walker, who actually coined the term third wave in a 1992 essay, and Naomi Woolf publishing The Beauty Myth.
The goals shifted dramatically. The third wave heavily emphasized individual sexual agency and bodily autonomy. They clashed intensely with the anti-pornography feminists of the second wave, who largely viewed sex work and pornography as inherent violence against women. Third wave feminists advocated for sex positivity, arguing that women should reclaim and define their own sexual pleasure without shame.
They also actively reclaimed traditionally feminine pursuits that the second wave had rejected. Many second-wave thinkers viewed fashion, makeup, shaving, and beauty culture as forms of false consciousness, distractions forced onto women by a patriarchal beauty industry to keep them insecure and objectified.
But third-wave feminists argued that aesthetics and fashion could be tools of self-expression and empowerment. They argued you can wear lipstick, high heels, and still be a fierce feminist dismantling the patriarchy. It was a massive embrace of contradiction.
But beneath the pop culture visibility of riot girls and sex positivity, the absolute philosophical bedrock of the third wave, the text that fundamentally altered the trajectory of academic gender theory, was Judith Butler's 1990 book, Gender Trouble.
Yes. This is a heavy hitter. We need to go slow here.
We really do.
Butler drew heavily on the post-structuralist critiques of language we discussed earlier, combined with Michel Foucault's theories on how power shapes the body. And she introduced a theory that shook the foundations of both feminism and biology. She introduced the concept of performativity. To understand this, we have to understand what she was attacking: biological essentialism.
Biological essentialism being the idea that your physical sex chromosomes, XX or XY, dictate an inherent, natural, immutable essence of who you are, how you behave, and what gender you belong to.
Precisely. The second wave, via Simone de Beauvoir, had already separated sex from gender. Sex was the biological hardware, gender was the cultural software programmed onto it. Butler went exponentially further. She argued that gender is not a noun, it is not something you are, it is a verb, it is something you do. Gender is a performative achievement.
So she is arguing that gender is produced entirely through the repeated, regulated performance of specific acts, gestures, clothing choices, and behaviors over time.
Exactly. Imagine a script handed to you at birth. By acting out the script every single day of your life, the pitch of your voice, the way you cross your legs, the clothes you buy, the way you express emotion, you create the powerful illusion that an internal, natural gender exists inside of you. But Butler argues there is no core gender identity behind the expressions. The performance itself creates the identity.
And this is the truly radical part. Butler argued that because gender is just a repeated performance, the biological category of sex itself is actually a social construct too. She suggested that we only obsess over binary biological differences because our social performance of gender requires a binary foundation to justify itself.
It's a circular logic.
Exactly. This theory didn't just advance feminism, it laid the absolute groundwork for queer theory and radically opened up the movement to transgender experiences and the full spectrum of gender nonconformity. It said, if the script is artificial, we can improvise, we can perform gender differently and break the system.
It was revolutionary.
Okay, but I have to push back on Butler's concept here on behalf of the listener, because this is where the theory can feel divorced from reality. If gender is just a performance, a series of acts and clothing choices, doesn't that deeply trivialize the very real physical, material dangers that women face under patriarchy?
I see where you're going.
Like if a woman is walking down a dark street at night and is sexually assaulted by a man, that isn't a theater performance. That is a brutal material reality based on her physical body and a man's physical power.
How does Butler reconcile gender as performance with the literal flesh and blood reality of sexist violence?
That is the most common and frankly the most crucial challenge to Butler's work. And the defense rests entirely on clarifying her use of the word performance. When people hear performance, they think of a theatrical play. An actor puts on a costume, plays Hamlet for 3 hours, and then takes the costume off and goes home.
It sounds fake. It implies agency and artificiality. Butler is not using it that way. She relies on the linguistic concept of performativity, meaning a legally or socially binding act. Think of a judge striking a gavel and saying, "I sentence you to prison." The words themselves enact the reality. They alter the material world.
So it is a compulsory binding performance. You don't get to step off the stage.
It is highly compulsory. The script of gender is brutally enforced by society through the constant threat of ostracization, institutional punishment, and physical violence. When Butler says gender is a performance, she isn't saying it is fake, trivial, or harmless. She's saying the social structure forces you to perform it, and if you deviate from the script, if you perform the wrong gender, or perform it inadequately, society will punish you violently.
Wow, okay.
The danger, the violence, the material consequences are incredibly real. Butler is simply arguing that the origin of that danger is a social policing mechanism, not an inevitable biological destiny.
That distinction makes a world of difference. It grounds the abstract theory back in the reality of power. So the third wave deeply embraced this individual expression, this deconstruction of categories, this fluidity. But as we move into the 2010s, the landscape changes again.
The world goes online.
A brand new, unprecedented technological tool emerges. And it takes all these highly individualized, fractured voices of the third wave and suddenly provides the infrastructure for them to merge back into a massive, synchronized global roar. Welcome to the fourth wave and the global frontier.
The fourth wave, stretching from the early 2010s to our present moment, is defined almost entirely by its geography and its tempo. The geography is the internet, and the tempo is instantaneous.
Social media completely changed the physics of political organizing. If you look back at the first or second waves, organizing required intense physical and logistical effort. You needed to rent a union hall, print thousands of newsletters, lick stamps, organize phone trees, and physically coordinate thousands of bodies to march in a street.
It took months.
Exactly. But social media, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, allowed feminist sentiment to bypass traditional media gatekeepers and mobilize across national borders in literal seconds. A local instance of injustice in one city could achieve global, viral resonance overnight.
And the absolute defining manifestation of this digital power is, without question, the #MeToo movement. It exploded into global consciousness in October 2017, following the investigative reports exposing the decades of horrific sexual abuse by Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein. But it is historically vital to note that the phrase and the framework were originally created over a decade earlier in 2006 by a Black activist named Tarana Burke, specifically to help young women of color who had survived sexual violence.
The genius of the #MeToo hashtag was that it functioned as a massive, decentralized, digital consciousness-raising group. It took what had previously been hidden, private, isolated suffering, the harassment in the office, the assault at the party, the coercion by a boss, and turned it into an unavoidable tsunami of collective public data.
It quantified the trauma.
Millions of women globally shared their experiences. It quantified the scope of the problem. in a way that made the sheer pervasiveness of sexual violence impossible for polite society to ignore or deny anymore.
It was a monumental shift. And unlike a purely theoretical debate, #MeToo yielded immediate, tangible, institutional consequences. Incredibly powerful men across media, politics, and corporate America lost their jobs and faced criminal prosecution. State legislatures passed new laws regarding non-disclosure agreements and sexual harassment training. Cultural norms around consent and accountability genuinely shifted.
But the fourth wave is also characterized by the extreme intensity, visibility, and sometimes vitriol of its internal debates. Because the internet brings everyone across generations, classes, and theories into the exact same digital room, the arguments within the feminist family are constant and public. And looking at our sources, it's important to objectively map the contours of these contemporary debates.
Absolutely. The most heavily contested and frankly polarized debate within contemporary feminism right now centers on transgender inclusion. On one side, you have what are termed gender-critical feminists. They argue that the political and historical category of woman must be strictly grounded in female biological sex. They argue that women face specific oppression based on their reproductive biology, and therefore transgender women who are assigned male at birth do not share that specific historical class experience and should not have access to female-only spaces or sports.
On the other side, you have trans-inclusive or intersectional feminists. They argue that excluding trans women reproduces the exact same logic of biological essentialism, policing of bodies, and exclusionary gatekeeping that feminism was originally created to fight against. They argue trans women face horrific levels of patriarchal violence precisely because they transgress gender norms. And the real-world stakes of this debate are incredibly high. It dictates policy regarding access to domestic violence shelters, healthcare, legal recognition, and basic safety.
Another major contemporary framework gaining massive urgency is ecofeminism. As the global climate crisis accelerates, ecofeminists draw deep structural, historical, and ideological connections between the patriarchal domination of women and the capitalist exploitation of nature.
I find this fascinating. Unpack how those two things are linked for me. How does capitalism treat a forest the same way it treats a woman?
Historically, patriarchal philosophy has closely associated women with nature, emotion, and the physical body, while associating men with culture, reason, and the mind. Thinkers like Carolyn Merchant have shown how, with the rise of the scientific revolution and capitalism, nature was stripped of its sacred or organic qualities and redefined merely as a dead, mechanistic resource to be extracted for profit. Ecofeminists argue that capitalism treats the earth exactly how it treats women's bodies, as an infinite, unpaid, entirely disposable resource designed solely to fuel male-dominated economic growth. They argue you cannot save the planet without dismantling the patriarchal mindset that views all life as something to be conquered and consumed.
You also see intense activism from sex worker activism in the fourth wave. This is a direct pushback against the older radical feminist frameworks that viewed all sex work, including pornography and prostitution, as inherently coercive and a manifestation of patriarchal violence against women. Modern sex worker activists demand a very clear legal and conceptual distinction between human trafficking, which is horrific, coerced violence that must be eradicated and voluntary, consensual sex work. They are demanding labor rights, decriminalization, and the right to participate in defining the policies that directly affect their own physical safety and economic survival.
And critically, the fourth wave centers the framework of reproductive justice. This concept was developed by Black women activists in the 1990s who recognized that the mainstream liberal feminist demand, which was narrowly focused on the right to choose an abortion, was wildly insufficient for marginalized communities.
Because if you are poor or facing systemic racism, having the legal right to an abortion means very little if you don't have the money to pay for it, or a clinic within 300 miles of your home.
Exactly. Reproductive justice expands the lens radically. It insists on the right to not have children, yes, but it equally insists on the right to have children, free from state coercion, a crucial point given the horrific history of forced sterilizations of Black, Latina, and Indigenous women in the United States. And furthermore, it demands the right to raise those children in safe, supportive, economic, and environmental conditions. It makes visible how economic inequality, environmental racism, lack of health care, and police violence completely dictate the reality of reproduction.
And while all these complex debates are raging online, we absolutely must widen our lens to recognize the vast global dimensions of feminism. Because our historical narrative thus far, governed by Western academia, often defaults to a Eurocentric view. But feminism has never been solely a Western phenomenon.
Absolutely not. Feminist movements in the global South often operate with entirely different vocabularies and priorities, shaped directly by the legacies of colonialism, extreme poverty, and post-colonial state formation. Take Wangari Maathai, the Kenyan activist and Nobel laureate who founded the Greenbelt movement.
Tell me about her.
She organized thousands of rural Kenyan women to plant millions of trees. She brilliantly fused environmental restoration with economic independence and political empowerment, directly challenging both patriarchal land ownership laws and corrupt dictatorial state power. It is a profound example of post-colonial African feminism in action.
Or look at Latin America, where feminist resistance was heavily shaped by fighting against brutal, U.S.-backed military dictatorships in the 1970s and 80s, often integrating with liberation theology to demand human rights and locate the disappeared. And speaking of theology, religious feminism is a massive, highly active global frontier today. You have brilliant scholars across Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions arguing that the deeply patriarchal interpretations of their faiths are not actually intrinsic to the religion itself. They are historical, man-made accretions.
These scholars are doing the incredibly rigorous, radical work of returning to the original sacred texts, the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, and reading them through alternative, non-patriarchal, historically contextualized lenses. They are finding evidence of women's spiritual authority that was deliberately erased by centuries of male clergy.
Which is deeply controversial within conservative religious institutions, of course. Traditionalists claim the scriptural foundations are fixed and divinely ordained, while feminist theologians argue that religion is a living, breathing tradition, and that women's spiritual resistance proves a feminist faith is not an oxymoron, but a divine imperative.
It is a vibrant, incredibly courageous field of study and activism.
So when we step back and look at the staggering scope of modern feminism, from fighting deforestation in Kenya to organizing sex workers on Twitter to rewriting Islamic theology to the #MeToo movement taking down Hollywood executives, I have to ask, with so many vastly different battles happening simultaneously across completely different contexts, what is the central gravity? What is the glue that keeps the modern feminist movement from just flying apart entirely into a million special interest groups?
The glue remains what we established at the very beginning of this conversation. It is that shared, fundamental refusal to accept the subordination of women as a natural, inevitable, or divinely ordained fact of the universe. The targets have multiplied, the theoretical frameworks have fractured and complexified to match the complexity of the world, but the core analytical engine remains identical. That engine asks three questions. Who holds power? How do they justify holding it? And how can that power structure be dismantled to ensure genuine human flourishing? That engine is still humming at the heart of every single one of those diverse movements.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive. We have covered centuries of intellectual history, bloody protests, and complex theory. So to ensure we've truly organized this map for you, let's do a concise, high-level summary of the core evolutionary leaps across the four waves.
Certainly. The first wave, emerging from the intellectual earthquake of the Enlightenment, essentially demanded basic entry into the human race they fought for, the formal, legal, and political rights to vote, own property, and exist as civic equals.
Right. And then the second wave.
The second wave realized that laws aren't enough. They moved beyond the courts to expose the hidden structural and cultural systems of oppression. They diagnosed patriarchy as a political institution operating in the kitchen, the workplace, and the bedroom, declaring that the personal is political.
Got it. And the third wave.
The third wave, heavily influenced by intersectionality and post-structuralism, blew up the rigid, exclusionary definitions of identity. They insisted that gender is a compulsory performance, they embraced contradiction and multiplicity, and they shattered the illusion of a single, universal woman.
And finally, the fourth wave.
And the fourth wave has weaponized digital connectivity to demand global accountability, centering intersectional justice, rapid mass mobilization, and fighting multifaceted battles across the internet, the environment, and global supply chains.
It is an incredible, breathless trajectory. But despite all that progress, we have to look around at the world today and recognize that substantive equality remains painfully elusive. This is an entirely unfinished project. Despite the formal legal equality won a century ago, we still see persistent, staggering gender pay gaps globally. Domestic violence and sexual assault remain at epidemic rates, often treated with impunity. Hard-won reproductive rights are currently facing sustained, successful legislative attacks all over the world. And the recent global pandemic brutally exposed the socialist feminist critique. When the economy shut down, the disproportionate crushing burden of unpaid care work and homeschooling fell squarely immediately back onto the shoulders of women.
The debates we've traced today, the fierce arguments over intersectionality, the relationship between sex and gender, the invisible exploitation of domestic labor under capitalism, these are not mere academic squabbles happening in university ivory towers. They are the vital, ongoing life-or-death struggles over what liberation actually requires in a world that is still profoundly structurally unequal.
In that reality, it leads me to one final provocative thought for you to mull over as we close the books on this deep dive. Feminism has spent centuries refusing to accept the natural or inevitable state of the world. It fought the physical laws of men, the cultural narratives of men, and the economic systems of men. But as we stand here today, we are increasingly moving our entire civilization, our labor, our social lives, our legal decisions, our healthcare, into virtual spaces and AI-driven realities. And these new artificial intelligence systems are currently being built, trained, and coded using the historical data of our deeply, fundamentally unequal world. The biases of the past are being baked into the algorithms of the future. So will the next wave of feminism have to fight its battles against algorithms that we cannot even see, against decisions made in a black box? What does a feminist rebellion actually look like when the patriarchy isn't just in the laws of parliament or the pages of a novel, but is literally written into the foundational code of the future?
That is the ultimate frontier. Because as we established when we first sat down at this table, the diagnostic landscape of power is never clean. It is never binary, it is murky, and it is constantly evolving to protect itself.
The map is torn, the code is biased, the centuries-long dinner party is migrating into the metaverse, and the argument is far, far from over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the code.